The wind howled like a banshee starved, tearing at the flimsy cabin walls, finding every crack and crevice with icy fingers. Elara huddled closer to the meager fire, its warmth a fragile shield against the brutal onslaught of the blizzard. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white, blinding and suffocating. It had been days since the storm began, days since the last ember of hope had flickered in her chest, leaving behind only a cold, hollow ache. The provisions were dwindling, a grim tally she whispered to herself each morning, each night. A half loaf of hard bread, a handful of beans, dwindling firewood. Survival felt less like a possibility and more like a cruel taunt. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone. The cabin, perched precariously on the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness, had been her husband Thomas's dream, a dream that had crumbled into dust and snow the moment a stray bullet found him 6 months ago. Now it was her cage and the storm her executioner. Fear was a constant, heavy presence in the small space, a living thing that coiled in her gut and tightened her chest until breathing felt like a luxury. She saw his face in the firelight, kind eyes, a gentle smile, a warmth she would never feel again. The world had promised her a life, a partnership, a future. It had delivered solitude, hardship, and the gnawing certainty that she was not strong enough to face it. Tears had long since frozen on her cheeks, leaving behind a tight, brittle mask. Survival felt pointless without him, yet the primal instinct clung fiercely, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. But the cold, oh, the relentless cold, was winning. It seeped into her bones, numbing her limbs, whispering promises of a quiet end if only she would cease the futile struggle. She closed her eyes, picturing the drift piled against the door, a white tombstone sealing her fate. A sudden, sharp rap against the door startled her, eyes flying open. Couldn't be. No one was out in this. No one could be out in this. Her heart leaped, a wild bird trapped in a cage of ribs. Was it a trick of the wind? Another groan of the old wood? The rap came again, firmer this time, insistent. Not the wind. Panic flared, sharp and immediate. Who would be here? A trapper? Unlikely. A drifter? More likely and perhaps more dangerous. She hadn't seen another soul for weeks. The fear warred with a flicker, a desperate, irrational spark of hope. Someone was out there. Someone had made it through the impossible. Hesitantly, she rose, her movements stiff and slow. The shotgun lay on the table, a relic of Thomas, heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. Her breath hitched as she approached the door, its thick wood a barrier between her and the unknown. She gripped the cold metal, her knuckles white. Another rap, louder now, a sound of raw need against the storm's fury. There was no going back. Taking a shaky breath, she reached for the bolt. The bolt slid back with a groan of old iron, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the storm's roar. She pulled the door inward just a crack, the wind tearing at it, bringing with it a blast of icy snow that stung her face. Silhouetted against the white chaos stood a figure, large and dark, coated in rime. He didn't speak, just stood there, a still point in the swirling madness, his eyes, 2 dark points in a face chapped and weathered, fixed on her. He looked like the wilderness itself had taken human form, rough, imposing, and utterly indifferent. He was broad-shouldered, wrapped in thick, frozen furs, snow caked on his hat and beard. Danger radiated from him, a quiet intensity that was more unsettling than any bluster. But beneath the danger, there was something else, a weariness, a shared understanding of the storm's brutality etched in the lines around his eyes. She held the shotgun steady, though her hands trembled. "Who are you?" The wind whipped her words away. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low rumble barely audible over the gale. "Lost my way." Seeking shelter, his words were clipped, devoid of pleasantries, but held no discernible threat, only a simple statement of fact and need. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed caution, warned her against opening her door to a stranger in this desolate place. But the storm screamed louder, and the image of freezing alone was a cold, hard reality. He didn't move, didn't press, just waited, a statue carved from ice and determination. His stillness was unnerving, yet it also conveyed a strange sort of patience. He wasn't demanding entry. He was presenting a grim necessity. She looked past him into the blinding snow, then back at the meager warmth of her fire. The choice felt monumental, a pivot point between certain lonely death and an uncertain, potentially dangerous survival. But the thought of turning away another human being into that felt wrong even in her fear-stricken state. Necessity often forged strange alliances. Slowly, reluctantly, she opened the door wider. "Come in." Quickly he stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of freezing air and melting snow. The change in atmosphere was immediate, the small cabin suddenly filled with his imposing presence. He closed the door firmly behind him, shutting out the storm's roar, though its muffled fury still vibrated through the walls. He didn't immediately shed his outer layers, instead standing just inside the door, water dripping onto the floorboards, his eyes scanning the cabin, assessing her, assessing the space. She still held the shotgun, watching him, her heart still racing. He seemed to understand, offering no challenge, no aggressive move. It was a silent acknowledgement of her fear and her need for self-preservation. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice still low, rough like grinding stones. It wasn't a warm thank you, but a simple, factual one. He made no move towards her, keeping a respectful distance near the door. This small deference eased her tension fractionally. He was acknowledging her space, her fear, her control of the situation, however fragile it might be. She lowered the shotgun slightly, but didn't put it down. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the heavy weight of their shared predicament. Two strangers, isolated by a world gone mad with ice and wind, bound together by the desperate need for shelter. He moved slowly, deliberately, shedding his layers of frozen furs and snow-crusted leather. He hung them by the door, creating a puddle on the floor that quickly began to freeze at the edges. He was tall, spare but muscled, his movements economical and efficient. He didn't ask questions, didn't make small talk. He simply existed in the space, a quiet, powerful presence. Alara watched him, the shotgun still loosely held. She had expected aggression, or at least a pushy intrusion, but he seemed content to wait, observing his surroundings with a keen, assessing gaze. His silence was not empty, but filled with a watchful energy. After a moment, he turned to the fire, extending his hands towards the flames. The heat seemed to draw the tension from his shoulders. "Storm's bad," he stated, the obvious truth a stark counterpoint to the cabin's relative peace. Alara nodded, unable to find her voice. She still felt the tremor in her hands. He glanced at her, his dark eyes holding a depth she couldn't fathom. There was no pity there, just a quiet understanding of the harsh reality they both faced. "Alara," she managed finally, her voice raspy. "My name is Alara." He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Kane, just the one word. It suited him, ancient, solitary, weighted with unknown history. He didn't offer more and she didn't ask. Trust was not given easily in this land, and certainly not earned in a few moments against a backdrop of howling wind. But his lack of intrusion, his quiet respect for her fear, it chipped away, however slightly, at the wall of terror she had built around herself. He didn't look at her like she was a helpless woman, but like another soul weathering the same storm, facing the same fight. He saw her strength, or perhaps the desperate attempt at it, and acknowledged it with his quiet presence. He looked around the small cabin again, his gaze resting briefly on the table, the meager supplies visible. He didn't comment, didn't ask about food, though he must have been as hungry and exhausted as she was. This restraint, this unspoken understanding of her vulnerability and limited resources, spoke volumes. She found herself lowering the shotgun fully, resting its butt on the floor. She didn't relax her guard entirely, but the immediate sharp fear had dulled into a wary acceptance. They were two castaways on a small island of warmth in a sea of ice. For now, that was enough. He finally turned away from the fire and went to the door, checking the bolt, testing the hinges. He was securing their shared shelter, a small, practical action that spoke of a shared fate, at least for the duration of the storm. He moved with a competence that was both reassuring and unsettling. She had been alone for so long, relying only on her own faltering capabilities. His quiet strength was a stark contrast to her own frayed nerves and dwindling hope. He sat down near the fire, across from her, not too close, not too far. The silence returned, but it was different now, less empty, more watchful, a shared vigil against the world outside. She watched him, the firelight playing across his rugged face, trying to read something in his impassive features. Was he just a man seeking shelter, or was there something more? The storm raged, a constant reminder of their isolation, but inside the cabin, a tentative connection, born of mutual necessity and unspoken understanding, was beginning to form in the quiet, firelit space. She felt a flicker, not of hope yet, but of something akin to resilience. She was not alone in facing this death. Days blurred into a timeless span governed only by the shifting intensity of the blizzard outside. The cabin became their world, small and fragile. Dialogue remained sparse, utility guiding their words, a shared observation about the diminishing woodpile, a quiet agreement on splitting the last of the beans. But understanding grew in the silence. Alara watched Kane. He was resourceful, finding ways to mend minor leaks the wind exploited, fashioning a better draft for the fire, always moving with a purpose that spoke of long familiarity with harsh conditions. He didn't intrude on her grief, didn't pry into her past, yet his presence was a silent acknowledgement of her struggle. He saw her rationing the food, the careful way she tended the fire, the weariness in her eyes. He never complained, never asked for more than his share. His stoicism was not indifference but a profound, quiet acceptance of hardship. Slowly, tentative trust bloomed. She found herself watching him not with fear, but with a cautious curiosity, then with a dawning respect. He was a man who knew how to survive, not with aggression, but with quiet capability and endurance. One evening, as the wind seemed to gain new ferocity, rattling the cabin to its foundations, a particularly violent gust ripped a section of shutters loose, sending snow spraying inward near the small window. Alara cried out, startled. Before she could react, Kane was on his feet, moving swiftly. He didn't ask her what to do. He simply acted. He grabbed a heavy blanket, wrestled the shutters back into place, and secured them with lengths of rope he somehow produced from his gear, working with a focused intensity that brooked no hesitation. When he was done, his face was grim, but the breach was sealed. "It holds," he said, his voice rough with effort. Alara looked at the secured window, then at him, a wave of gratitude washing over her. It was a small thing, fixing a shutter, but in that moment, it felt like he had held back the entire storm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. He just nodded, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he turned back to the fire. There was no need for elaborate thanks, no expectation of reward. It was simply what was necessary. His actions were his language, speaking of protection, capability, and a quiet strength that was both reassuring and humbling. She had been so consumed by her own fear and sorrow, feeling utterly helpless. Watching him, seeing his competence, sparked something within her. Resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding the strength to act, to mend, to face the onslaught. She began to mirror his quiet purpose, taking on small tasks she had neglected in her despair, feeling a flicker of pride in her own ability to contribute, however minimally, to their shared survival. The storm was still a terrifying force, but it no longer felt entirely insurmountable. They were facing it together, not as partners forged in love or friendship, but as two survivors sharing a foxhole, bound by the simple, profound need to see the dawn. The cabin, once her prison, felt slightly less suffocating, a shared refuge instead of a solitary tomb. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. One morning, the howling wind softened to a mournful sigh, and the blinding white outside gained definition. The sun, a pale, weak disk, struggled to pierce the heavy clouds. The drifts were monumental, burying the cabin almost to the roofline, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien, undulating world of white. Alara stood at the window, gazing out at the silent, snowbound world. The silence after the storm was almost deafening, broken only by the gentle creak of the snow-laden cabin. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a strange stillness, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. The storm had stripped everything away, her illusions of control, her ability to pretend she wasn't utterly alone, her husband's absence screaming in the silence. But in facing the raw, brutal force of nature, and in the quiet, unexpected presence of Cain, she had found a core of resilience she hadn't known existed. Cain stood beside her, looking out. He said nothing, but she felt his presence, solid and enduring. Their shared experience had forged a bond, unspoken but deeply felt. It wasn't love, or even necessarily friendship, but a mutual respect born of shared hardship and survival. They had faced the edge together and pulled each other back, not with grand gestures, but with quiet endurance and necessary actions. He turned to her then, his dark eyes reflecting the pale light from the window. There was no easy smile, no platitude, just a quiet acknowledgement of what they had endured. "It's over," he said, his voice low. A simple statement, yet it carried the weight of everything they had just lived through. Alara nodded, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks, not of despair, but of exhaustion, relief, and a strange, unexpected sense of dignity. She had survived. She had faced the monster and emerged, battered but not broken. The vulnerable woman who had huddled by the fire in terror felt like a ghost of the past. This woman, standing shoulder to shoulder with a stranger who had become a silent ally, felt different, stronger. The world outside was still harsh, still full of unknowns, full of the grief she carried, full of the judgment she might face as a woman alone. But she was not the same woman who had faced the storm's arrival in despair. She had found strength not in spite of her vulnerability, but by accepting it and finding the quiet courage to endure. Cain reached out, not to touch her, but simply placing a large, steady hand on the door frame near her head, a silent gesture of shared space and continued watchfulness. Their paths might diverge now the storm had passed, or they might not. The future was as uncertain as the vast, snow-covered landscape outside. But whatever came, Alara knew she would face it not with the crushing fear that had defined her before, but with the quiet resilience forged in the heart of the blizzard, a resilience she had discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances, facilitated by the quiet presence of an unexpected visitor. Survival was not just about staying alive. It was about finding the inner fortitude to stand tall against the storm, both within and without. And she had found it.